The morning started like any other aboard Kepler station, the massive diplomatic hub that served as neutral ground for the galaxy's most complex negotiations. Representatives from dozens of species moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, their various forms creating a tapestry of evolution that never ceased to amaze those who witnessed it for the first time. The air recyclers worked overtime to accommodate the diverse atmospheric requirements, while universal translators hummed quietly in the background, facilitating conversations between beings whose vocal cords had evolved under entirely different stellar conditions. Dr. Elena Vasquez had arrived 3 days prior as part of humanity's first official diplomatic mission to the Galactic Council. At 42 years old, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of international relations on Earth before humanity had even known they weren't alone in the universe. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her brown eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made her Earth's foremost expert in xenopolitical theory long before there were actual aliens to theorize about. The human delegation was small by necessity. Only 5 individuals had been selected to represent their entire species in this historic first contact scenario. Elena served as the lead cultural liaison, a role that had become infinitely more complex when the cultures in question belonged to beings who had evolved under different suns. She had spent the better part of 2 years studying every scrap of information the Galactic Council had provided about member species, learning their customs, their taboos, and their communication patterns. The Vraxians were warriors by nature, their reptilian forms standing nearly 8 feet tall with scales that seemed to absorb light. They valued strength above all else and had initially dismissed humanity as soft mammals unworthy of serious consideration. The Tellurians were hive-minded insectoids whose collective consciousness made them excellent administrators but difficult to relate to on an individual level. The Kythera were energy beings who existed partially in subspace, their forms shimmering between solid and ethereal states as they moved. Each species brought their own perspectives, their own biases, and their own completely alien ways of understanding the universe. Elena had been preparing for this moment her entire career, though she never could have imagined the circumstances that had brought humanity to the galactic stage. First contact had not come through grand exploration or deliberate seeking of other worlds. Instead, it had arrived in the form of a politely worded cease and desist order transmitted to Earth's governments 3 months prior. Humanity's rapid expansion into space, driven by advances in fusion technology and magnetic field manipulation, had apparently encroached upon what the Galactic Council considered protected space around developing civilizations. The irony was not lost on Elena that humanity's first interaction with galactic civilization had been essentially a cosmic parking ticket. Now, as she made her way through the station's central hub toward the commissary, Elena reflected on how the negotiations had progressed so far. The Galactic Council was not outright hostile to humanity, but they were deeply skeptical. Humans were seen as unpredictable, prone to violence, and lacking the technological sophistication of other spacefaring races. The fact that humanity had achieved interstellar travel through what the Council termed brute force engineering rather than elegant scientific advancement had not helped their case. The commissary aboard Kepler station was a marvel of engineering and diplomacy in its own right. The vast space was divided into environmental zones, each tailored to the specific needs of different species. Atmospheric composition, gravity, temperature, and even electromagnetic field strength could be adjusted on a table-by-table basis. It was here that the real work of diplomacy often took place, in informal conversations over meals that revealed more about a species' character than formal negotiations ever could. Elena had been looking forward to this particular meal for days. The station's food synthesizers were capable of creating virtually any known cuisine in the galaxy, but she had put in a special request through the Human Embassy's liaison office. Today, for the first time since arriving at Kepler station, she would taste something that reminded her of home. The package had arrived via diplomatic pouch 2 days earlier, a small collection of spices and seasonings from Earth, along with a protein synthesizer template for beef. Elena had submitted the proper forms, waited for the xenobiological safety clearance, and, finally, received approval to prepare what she privately thought of as real food for the first time in weeks. She found an empty table in the human-compatible zone and activated the environmental controls, setting gravity to Earth normal and adjusting the atmospheric composition to provide the familiar oxygen-nitrogen mix she had been breathing her entire life. The food synthesizer hummed to life as she input the parameters for her meal: a simple grilled steak, medium rare, with rosemary and garlic. As the synthesizer worked, Elena allowed herself a moment of homesickness. She thought of her apartment overlooking the Potomac, of Sunday dinners with her sister's family, of the way rain smelled on hot asphalt. These were sensory experiences that couldn't be replicated on a space station, no matter how advanced the technology. The universe was vast and full of wonders, but sometimes she missed the simple pleasure of walking barefoot through grass. The synthesizer chimed softly, and Elena retrieved her meal. The steak looked perfect, the protein matrix had replicated the familiar marbled texture of earth beef, and the synthesized seasonings filled the air with an aroma that transported her instantly back to her childhood. Her father had been the family's designated grill master, and summer evenings had often been spent in their backyard, the smell of cooking meat mixing with the scent of her mother's herb garden. Elena cut into the steak and took her first bite, closing her eyes to savor the familiar flavors. For a moment, she wasn't a diplomat representing humanity's interests in a cosmic civilization beyond anything her ancestors could have imagined. She was just a woman enjoying a good meal, surrounded by the comforting presence of memories. That moment of peace lasted exactly 37 seconds. "What is that horrific stench?" The voice cut through the ambient noise of the commissary like a blade, carrying with it a tone of such disgust and outrage that conversation stopped at nearby tables. Elena opened her eyes to find herself facing a being she had never seen before, though she recognized the species from her briefing materials. The creature before her was clearly Zilithian, 7 feet of pale, translucent flesh stretched over an elongated skeletal frame. Their species was known for their advanced biotechnology and their strict adherence to what they termed life-harmonious practices. The Zilithians' 4 eyes, arranged in a diamond pattern on their oval skull, were fixed on Elena's plate with an expression that somehow managed to convey both horror and moral superiority despite the creature's completely alien features. Their translator unit, a small device implanted near what might charitably be called their ear, rendered their native language into precise, clipped standard galactic with an accent that sounded vaguely European to Elena's earth-trained ear. "I beg your pardon?" Elena replied, setting down her fork and engaging her own translator. She had been briefed on Zilithian customs, but this level of hostility over a meal seemed extreme even for a species known for their rigid dietary practices. "That abomination you are consuming," the Zilithian continued, their voice rising to carry across the commissary. "Do you not understand what you are doing? Can your primitive mind not grasp the cosmic horror you have just committed?" Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always preceded a diplomatic crisis. Around them, other diners were beginning to take notice of the confrontation. She could see Vraxian heads turning, their predatory eyes gleaming with the promise of potential conflict. A table of Tellurians had begun the complex harmonized chittering that indicated their collective consciousness was focusing attention on the situation. "I'm simply eating a meal that was prepared according to proper safety protocols," Elena replied, keeping her voice level and professional. "If my choice of cuisine has somehow offended you, I apologize, but I was not aware that there were any restrictions on human dietary practices in this section of the commissary." The Zilithians' 4 eyes seemed to burn brighter, their pale flesh taking on a phosphorescent quality that Elena recognized from her briefings as a sign of extreme emotional agitation. "Dietary practices? You call the consumption of murdered flesh a mere dietary practice? You are eating death itself, consuming the suffering of a creature that lived and breathed and felt. It's synthesized protein," Elena explained, though she was beginning to realize that this conversation was moving beyond the realm of simple cultural misunderstanding. "No actual animal was harmed in its creation. The protein matrix is assembled at the molecular level using templates derived from silence." The Zilithian's voice had reached a pitch that hurt Elena's ears, and their translator was struggling to render the emotional undertones of their speech into standard galactic. "Do you think the method of creation matters? Do you believe that synthetic horror is somehow less horrific than the original? You humans claim to be civilized, yet you revel in the symbolic consumption of suffering." The commissary had fallen silent now, hundreds of beings from dozens of species watching the confrontation unfold. Elena was acutely aware that this moment could define not just her own diplomatic mission, but humanity's entire relationship with galactic civilization. Every word, every gesture, every breath was being analyzed by minds that had evolved under alien stars and processed information in ways she could barely comprehend. I understand that different species have different cultural and dietary practices, Elena said, rising slowly from her seat. She was considerably shorter than the Zilithian, but she had learned long ago that physical presence was less important than mental preparation when it came to managing international, or in this case, interstellar, incidents. Humans are omnivores by evolution. The consumption of protein from animal sources is a natural part of our biology and our cultural heritage. We mean no disrespect to species that have chosen different paths. Chosen different paths? The Zilithian's laugh was a sound like breaking glass, rendered by the translator as a harsh mechanical buzz. We did not choose evolution, human. We transcended it. 12,000 years ago, when your species was still painting in caves and worshipping fire, the Zilithian people made the conscious decision to abandon the barbarism of flesh consumption. We restructured our entire biology, rewrote our genetic code, transformed our civilization from one that took life to one that gave it. Elena felt a flash of anger but forced herself to maintain diplomatic composure. The reference to humanity's historical development was clearly intended as an insult, but rising to the bait would only make the situation worse. Instead, she focused on the broader implications of what the Zilithian was saying. "That's a remarkable achievement," she replied, meaning it. "The technological and social coordination required for that kind of species-wide biological modification is impressive by any standard. But surely you can understand that not every species follows the same developmental path. Diversity of thought and culture is what makes galactic civilization valuable." Diversity? The Zilithians stepped closer, their pale flesh now glowing with what Elena was beginning to recognize as bioluminescent rage. "You call murder diversity? You call the celebration of death a valuable cultural contribution? Look at what you are doing, human. Look at what you are choosing to put into your body." Elena glanced down at her half-finished steak, then back at the Zilithian. Around them, she could sense the tension building like pressure before a storm. Representatives from various species were watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to disgust to something that might have been anticipation. "I am eating a meal," she said simply. "A meal that reminds me of my home world and my family. If you find that offensive, I respect your right to that opinion, but I will not apologize for being human. It was the wrong thing to say." The Zilithians' four eyes blazed with cold fire, and, when they spoke, their voice carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the deck plates of the station itself. "Then, perhaps," they said, "it is time for the galaxy to reconsider whether being human is something that should be tolerated at all." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Elena realized with growing horror that she was no longer dealing with a simple cultural misunderstanding. The Zilithian statement had crossed a line that separated diplomatic disagreement from something far more dangerous, a direct challenge to humanity's right to exist as part of galactic civilization. Before Elena could respond, the situation escalated beyond anything her diplomatic training had prepared her for. The Zilithian raised one of their long, pale arms and pointed directly at her plate. When they spoke again, their voice carried across the entire commissary with the force of a pronouncement. "Behold the true nature of humanity," they declared. "A species so wedded to violence and death that they recreate the act of murder for pleasure. They cannot conceive of existence without the consumption of suffering. They are predators, masquerading as diplomats, and they will bring their barbarism to every world they touch." Elena felt the weight of hundreds of alien gazes focused on her, and, in that moment, she understood that she was no longer just representing herself or even the human diplomatic mission. She had become a symbol of her entire species, standing trial in the court of galactic opinion for the crime of being what evolution had made her. The silence that followed the Zilithian's pronouncement was deafening. Elena could hear the soft hum of the station's environmental systems, the distant whisper of atmospheric recyclers, the subtle vibration of the fusion reactors that powered this monument to interstellar cooperation. But, from the gathered representatives of dozens of alien civilizations, there was nothing but watchful quiet. It was in that silence that Elena made the decision that would define not just her own fate, but the future relationship between humanity and the galaxy. She could apologize, back down, accept the Zilithians' characterization and hope to salvage some small diplomatic victory from the wreckage of the situation. She could try to explain away humanity's nature, to minimize their differences and seek accommodation with those who found their existence fundamentally offensive. Or she could stand up. Elena picked up her fork, cut another piece of steak, and took a deliberate bite. She chewed slowly, savoring the flavors that connected her to home, to family, to the long chain of human experience that had brought her to this moment. When she swallowed, she looked directly into the Zilithian's 4 burning eyes and spoke with quiet dignity. "My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez," she said. "I represent the United Earth government and the 3 billion human beings who call Earth home. We are what we are: predators, survivors, builders, dreamers, killers, and creators. We do not apologize for our nature, because our nature is what brought us to the stars." The Zilithian recoiled as if struck. "You admit it then? You acknowledge your barbarism?" "I acknowledge our complexity," Elena replied. She set down her fork and stood to her full height, modest though it was compared to most of the beings watching her. "Yes, humans are predators. We evolved from creatures that hunted and killed to survive. But we are also the species that chose to reach beyond our world not for conquest, but for wonder. We are the people who looked at the stars and decided that the universe was too beautiful to experience alone." She gestured around the commissary, taking in the incredible diversity of life forms that surrounded them. "Every species here has a history of survival. Every one of you carries the genetic legacy of ancestors who did whatever was necessary to pass their genes to the next generation. Some of you evolved as plant eaters, some as scavengers, some as energy consumers or mineral processors or things I cannot even comprehend. But all of you are here because your ancestors were successful survivors." "Survival does not excuse barbarity," the Zilithian spat. "No," Elena agreed. "But neither does civilization require the abandonment of what we are. You ask me to be ashamed of eating meat? Very well, I eat meat. My ancestors ate meat. My children will probably eat meat. But those same ancestors also painted the walls of caves with images of beauty, created music and poetry and philosophy, built cities and governments and dreams of better futures. They reached for the stars not because they had transcended their nature, but because their nature included the capacity for transcendence." The Vraxian commander had risen from his table and was moving closer, his massive reptilian form creating a presence that seemed to shift the very gravity of the room. When he spoke, his voice carried the rumble of distant thunder. "The human speaks with wisdom," he said, his translator rendering his native growls into precise standard galactic. "The Vraxian people understand the hunt, the kill, the consumption of one's enemies. These are honest things, clean things. There is no shame in acknowledging the teeth that evolution gave you." The Zilithian turned their 4-eyed glare on the Vraxian commander. "You would support these murderers? You would ally yourself with beings who celebrate death?" "I would ally myself with beings who do not lie about what they are," the Vraxian replied. His hand rested casually on the ceremonial blade at his side, and Elena realized with growing alarm that the situation was spiraling beyond diplomatic discourse towards something that might involve actual violence. "Commander Zethkar," Elena said, using the formal address she had learned from her briefing materials. "I appreciate your support, but I think we can resolve this matter without what, human?" The Vraxian's eyes, like molten gold in his scaled face, fixed on her with predatory intensity. "Without honesty? Without acknowledging the fundamental truth that survival requires strength? Your Zilithian friend here wishes to deny the reality of existence itself." A new voice entered the conversation, this one carrying the harmonic complexity that indicated a Tellurian collective speaking in unison. The Tellurian collective observes that this discourse has moved beyond matters of dietary preference into questions of fundamental compatibility between species with different evolutionary backgrounds. Elena turned to face the cluster of insectoid beings that had spoken. The Tellurian collective functioned as a hive mind, with individual drones serving as extensions of a larger consciousness that spanned their entire species. Dealing with them was like negotiating with a nation that could literally speak with one voice. The collective has analyzed human behavioral patterns based on available data, the harmonized voice continued. Humans exhibit approximately 40% more aggressive tendency than the galactic average, but also show 60% greater capacity for individual initiative and 80% higher rates of creative problem solving under pressure. These characteristics correlate with their predatory evolutionary background but also with traits that have historically proven valuable in interspecies cooperation scenarios. The clinical precision of the analysis was somehow more unsettling than the Zilithians' emotional accusations. Elena realized she was watching her species being dissected by minds that processed information in ways she could barely comprehend. "You reduce us to statistics," she said to the Tellurians. "But humans are more than the sum of our behavioral patterns." "All beings are more than statistical models," the collective replied. However, statistical models provide useful frameworks for predicting compatibility and managing risk in interspecies relationships. The collective is prepared to recommend trial integration protocols for human participation in galactic civilization, with appropriate safeguards. Safeguards? Elena felt her diplomatic composure beginning to crack. What kind of safeguards? Monitoring of expansion patterns to ensure compliance with protected space regulations. Regular psychological evaluation of human diplomatic personnel to identify potential aggressive tendencies. Restrictions on military vessel construction and deployment. Standard risk management protocols for species with elevated predatory characteristics. Elena stared at the cluster of Tellurian drones, trying to process what she was hearing. The beings that had seemed most reasonable, most scientific in their approach, were calmly discussing the terms under which humanity might be permitted to exist in galactic civilization. The clinical language couldn't hide the fundamental nature of what was being proposed. Humanity would be treated as a probationary species, monitored and controlled like dangerous children who might hurt themselves or others if left unsupervised. "I see," she said quietly. "And if we refuse these safeguards?" The Zilithians' four eyes blazed with satisfaction. "Then, perhaps the galaxy would be better served by containing your barbarism to your own solar system. A quarantine zone, where you can consume your synthetic flesh and practice your primitive rituals without contaminating more advanced civilizations." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Quarantine. Isolation. Humanity trapped in their own system while the rest of the galaxy moved forward without them. She thought of the research stations humanity had been building, the terraforming projects that would give her species new worlds to explore and inhabit. She thought of the cultural exchanges that had been planned, the scientific collaborations that could advance human understanding by centuries. All of it could disappear in an instant if this conversation went wrong. But, as she stood there, surrounded by beings who saw her species as either a threat to be managed or a problem to be solved, Elena felt something stirring deep in her chest. It was not the cool rationality of diplomatic training or the careful calculation of political strategy. It was something more fundamental, more human. It was anger. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the complex harmonies of interspecies discussion like a blade through silk. The single word seemed to catch every being in the commissary off guard. Elena could see confusion in alien eyes, hear the subtle shifts in translator frequencies as they processed her unexpected response. "No," the Zilithian repeated, their pale flesh flickering with patterns Elena couldn't interpret. "No," Elena said again, louder this time. She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the towering alien. "You want to know what humanity is? You want to understand what makes us different? Here's the truth, we don't ask permission to exist." She turned to address the entire commissary, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. "My species spent 50,000 years climbing from caves to stars, and we did it without anyone's help or approval. We built civilizations and tore them down and built them again. We painted beauty and created music and wrote poetry while your species were still learning to use tools. We fought wars and made peace and fought wars again because that's what survival looks like when you're not content to simply exist." The Vraxian commander was watching her with something that might have been approval, but Elena was beyond caring about alien reactions. She was speaking from a place deeper than diplomacy, drawing on reserves of human stubbornness that had carried her species from the African savanna to the edge of the galaxy. "You think we're barbaric because we eat meat? Fine.
You think we're violent because we haven't abandoned our evolutionary heritage? Accepted. You want to put us in quarantine because we make you uncomfortable? Try it. The last two words rang out across the commissary with a finality that seemed to surprise Elena herself. She realized she had just issued what amounted to a challenge to the most powerful political entity in the galaxy, and she found that she didn't care. The Zilithians stepped back, their four eyes wide with what Elena interpreted as shock. You dare to threaten the Galactic Council? You insignificant predator, you cannot comprehend the forces you are challenging. I'm not threatening anyone, Elena replied, her voice steady and cold. I'm simply explaining reality. Humanity didn't ask for your permission to develop interstellar travel, and we won't ask for your permission to continue using it. We didn't seek your approval to establish research stations and colonies, and we won't accept your restrictions on our expansion. We came here as a courtesy, to introduce ourselves to galactic civilization and explore the possibility of cooperation. But we will not be caged. The Tellurian collective's harmonized voice cut through the tension. The human representative appears to be rejecting all proposed integration protocols. This suggests fundamental incompatibility with established galactic governance structures. Perhaps, Elena said, turning to face the cluster of insectoid beings, the problem is not with human nature, but with your assumption that every species needs to be governed by external authority. Humanity has never responded well to ultimatums, and we have a long history of disappointing people who try to tell us what we can and cannot do. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. You want to know who we are? We are the species that looked at an impossible ocean and built ships to cross it. We are the people who stared up at the moon and decided it needed footprints. We are the civilization that split the atom, decoded our own genetics, and taught machines to think. And we did all of it while eating meat, fighting wars, and refusing to apologize for being exactly what we are. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This was not the watchful tension of potential conflict, but something deeper, a recognition that the conversation had moved beyond diplomatic formalities into territory where words carried the weight of historical consequence. It was the Vraxian commander who finally broke the silence. The human speaks of strength, he said, his massive form radiating approval. This is something the Vraxian people understand. We too have faced those who would limit our nature, who would force us to abandon the warrior's path for the sake of their comfort. The galaxy is vast enough for many different ways of life. The Vraxian perspective is noted, the Tellurian collective replied with harmonic precision. However, interspecies stability requires common frameworks for behavior and governance. Species that reject integration protocols create systemic instabilities that affect all galactic civilization. Elena felt a moment of clarity, as if the complex political situation had suddenly simplified into its essential elements. This was not really about meat consumption or human nature or evolutionary heritage. This was about power, and who would have the authority to determine how intelligent species related to each other across the vast distances of interstellar space. You want a common framework, she asked the Tellurians. Here's one: mutual respect. Not integration, not monitoring, not safeguards or quarantine zones. Simple recognition that every species has the right to exist according to their own nature, as long as that existence doesn't actively harm others. Human expansion has already violated protected space agreements, the Zilithian interjected. Your species demonstrates no respect for established boundaries. Because we didn't know they existed, Elena shot back. You never bothered to introduce yourselves until we crossed some invisible line. That's not disrespect, that's ignorance. There's a difference. She took a deep breath, recognizing that the next words she spoke might determine humanity's future in the galaxy. Here's what I propose: humanity will acknowledge the existence of protected spaces and work with the Council to establish clear boundaries for our expansion. In return, the Council will recognize our right to exist without interference or monitoring within our own sphere of influence. No integration protocols, no behavioral modification programs, no external oversight. Equal partners, not client species seeking approval. The proposal hung in the air like a challenge, and Elena could see alien minds processing implications she could only guess at.
She had essentially demanded that humanity be treated as an equal partner in galactic civilization despite being the newest and least technologically advanced member species.
From a diplomatic standpoint, it was an outrageous position to take. But Elena was no longer thinking like a diplomat.
She was thinking like a human, drawing on 50,000 years of stubborn refusal to bow to those who claimed authority without earning respect.
The Zilithians' response was immediate and predictable. Impossible.
Your species lacks the technological sophistication, the social development, the moral evolution necessary for equal partnership. You are children playing with dangerous toys, demanding to be treated as adults.
Then, maybe, Elena said quietly, it's time for you to learn something about human children.
She moved before anyone could react, turning back to her table and picking up the knife she had been using to cut her steak. It was a simple utensil, barely 6 inches of molecular bonded metal designed for the mundane task of food preparation.
But, as Elena held it up for the entire commissary to see, it became something more.
This is a knife, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent space.
One of humanity's oldest tools.
We used them to cut meat, to defend ourselves, to build cities and carve sculptures and perform surgery to save lives. A knife can be a weapon or an instrument of creation, depending on the hand that holds it and the heart that guides it. She set the knife down on the table, the soft click of metal on synth ceramic loud in the absolute quiet.
You look at humans and see the knife.
You see the potential for violence, for destruction, for barbarism.
And, you know what? You're not wrong.
We are capable of incredible violence. We have destroyed entire civilizations, poisoned our own world, turned our greatest discoveries into weapons of mass destruction. Elena paused, letting the admission hang in the air before continuing. But, we're also the species that chose to reach for the stars instead of using our nuclear weapons to destroy ourselves. We're the people who looked at our poisoned world and decided to heal it. We're the civilization that learned to split atoms and chose to use that power to light cities instead of ending them. She gestured around the commissary, taking in the incredible diversity of life that surrounded them. Every species here has made similar choices. The Vraxians could have remained eternal warriors, conquering and destroying until nothing was left. Instead, they chose to become protectors of galactic stability. The Tellurians could have remained isolated in their hive mind perfection, but they chose to engage with chaotic individual consciousness because diversity makes them stronger. Elena's gaze fixed on the Zilithian, whose pale flesh had dimmed to a soft phosphorescence. And your people chose to transcend their violent past and become nurturers of life.
That's admirable. That's beautiful.
But don't mistake your path for the only path. She picked up her fork and took another bite of steak, chewing deliberately while hundreds of alien eyes watched her every move. When she swallowed, she smiled, not the careful diplomatic expression she had worn for 3 days, but the genuine, slightly reckless grin that her sister had always said would get her into trouble someday. Humanity chooses to remain what we are while becoming something more, she said.
We will eat meat and reach for stars.
We will fight wars and write poetry. We will remain predators while learning to nurture.
We will stay human while becoming galactic citizens.
And if that makes you uncomfortable, if that threatens your carefully ordered vision of civilized behavior, then maybe the problem isn't with us.
The commissary erupted.
Dozens of voices filled the air as representatives from various species began discussing, arguing, and debating in languages that the universal translators struggled to render into coherent standard galactic.
Elena could hear fragments of conversation, risk assessments from the Tellurians, challenges and approvals from various Vraxian factions, harmonic analyses from species she didn't recognize.
But, cutting through it all was the Zilithian's voice, raised to a pitch that hurt Elena's ears.
This is exactly what I warned against. They refuse to evolve beyond their barbarism.
They celebrate their primitive nature. They will contaminate every world they touch with their violence and their death worship.
Enough.
The single word came from an unexpected source, a figure that had been sitting quietly at a corner table, unnoticed in the drama that had consumed the commissary's attention. Elena turned to see a being she recognized from her briefing materials but had never expected to encounter. The Kythera were rarely seen in corporeal form, existing primarily as energy patterns in subspace. But, the figure rising from the corner table was unmistakably one of the galaxy's most enigmatic species. The Kythera stood nearly 9 feet tall, their form seeming to shift between solid matter and something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. When they moved, reality seemed to bend around them, as if space itself was adjusting to accommodate their presence. Their voice, when they spoke, carried harmonics that resonated in dimensions Elena's human senses couldn't quite process. "I am weaver of distant songs," the Kythera said, their words somehow reaching every being in the commissary without seeming to be spoken aloud. "I have observed this discourse with growing interest." The entire commissary fell silent. The Kythera rarely participated directly in galactic politics, preferring to observe and occasionally offer counsel that was invariably cryptic but often proved prophetic. For one to intervene directly in a diplomatic situation was unprecedented. "The young predator speaks wisdom," Weaver of Distant Songs continued, their attention focused on Elena with an intensity that made her feel as if she were being examined at the molecular level. "But, more than wisdom, she speaks truth. The galaxy has grown comfortable, safe, predictable. We have forgotten that growth requires challenge, that strength requires resistance, that beauty requires contrast." The Kythera turned their attention to the Zilithian, and Elena could see the pale being actually step backward under the weight of that gaze. "You speak of evolution, Zilithian, as if it were a destination rather than a journey. You have achieved great beauty in your transcendence, but beauty without struggle becomes mere decoration. Peace without the possibility of conflict becomes stagnation." "Weaver of Distant Songs," the Zilithian said, their voice now carrying a note of uncertainty, "surely you cannot approve of their barbarism?" "I approve of their honesty," the Kythera replied. "And their courage. They stand before the assembled representatives of galactic civilization and refuse to apologize for what they are. That requires a form of strength that we have not seen in this galaxy for many cycles." The ancient being's attention shifted to encompass the entire commissary. "The humans will join galactic civilization," they said with quiet certainty. "Not because they have been granted permission, but because they have already chosen to do so. The question is not whether they will be allowed to participate, but whether we will be wise enough to learn from what they have to teach." "And what," the Tellurian collective asked with harmonic precision, "do you believe they have to teach us?" Weaver of Distant Songs was quiet for a long moment, their form shifting through patterns of light and shadow that hurt to look at directly. When they finally spoke, their words carried the weight of eons. "That civilization is not the abandonment of nature, but its fulfillment. That strength and compassion can coexist. That the predator who chooses mercy is more noble than the pacifist who knows no other path. The humans carry within them the full spectrum of possibility, creation and destruction, love and hate, wisdom and folly. They are what we all once were, before we chose to become only part of what we could be." Elena felt tears she hadn't realized were forming begin to flow down her cheeks. The Kythera's words were more than approval, they were recognition of something she had felt but never been able to articulate about her own species. "The galaxy has achieved peace through the elimination of conflict," Weaver of Distant Songs continued. "Stability through the suppression of chaos. Order through the limitation of possibility. These are not failures, but they are not the only path. The humans offer us the chance to remember what we chose to forget, that the greatest beauty emerges from the union of opposites." The Zilithian's pale flesh flickered with patterns of distress. "You speak of chaos as if it were desirable. The humans will bring violence, disruption, the breakdown of everything we have built." "Perhaps," the Kythera agreed. "Change always carries that risk. But the alternative to change is death, the slow, peaceful death of a galaxy that has chosen safety over growth, comfort over possibility, order over life." Elena found herself speaking without conscious decision, the words emerging from some deep place within her that recognized the truth of what the Kythera was saying. "We don't want to destroy what you've built. We want to add to it. We want to bring our chaos to your order, our questions to your answers, our hunger to your satisfaction. Not to tear down, but to build something new, something that neither of us could create alone." "And if your chaos proves destructive," the Zilithian demanded. "If your hunger consumes rather than creates?" Then, you'll stop us, Elena replied simply.
The galaxy survived before humans existed, and it will survive after we're gone.
But, while we're here, while we're part of this incredible community of minds and souls and possibilities, we'll give everything we have to making it better. She looked around the commissary, taking in the dozens of alien faces watching her with expressions she couldn't read but somehow understood.
We'll make mistakes. We'll cause problems. We'll ask questions you don't want to answer and challenge assumptions you'd rather leave unexamined.
But we'll also bring energy and innovation and a perspective that comes from never accepting that something is impossible just because it's never been done before. Elena picked up her knife again, holding it so the light from the overhead panels caught the molecular bonded edge.
This is still a knife. It's still a tool that can cut and hurt and destroy.
But it's also the instrument I use to prepare a meal that connects me to my home, my family, my heritage. The danger isn't in the tool, it's in forgetting that tools are shaped by the hands that hold them and the hearts that guide them. She set the knife down one final time and looked directly into the Zilithian's four burning eyes.
Humanity will be part of galactic civilization.
Not as children seeking approval, not as barbarians learning to be civilized, not as a problem to be managed or a threat to be contained. We'll be partners, equals, contributors to something larger than any one species could build alone. And if you can't accept that, if the idea of predators among your herbivores is too frightening to contemplate, then maybe the problem isn't with human nature, maybe it's with your faith in the very civilization you claim to be protecting. The silence that followed was absolute. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, feel the weight of alien gazes pressing against her like physical force. She had committed herself, her species, her entire world to a path that would either lead to unprecedented cooperation or complete isolation from the galactic community. There was no middle ground left, no room for diplomatic compromise or face-saving measures. The future of humanity among the stars would be decided in the next few moments, and Elena realized that she had never felt more human than she did right now, standing alone against impossible odds, refusing to back down, insisting on the right to be exactly what she was. It was Weaver of Distant Songs who broke the silence, their form shifting into patterns that seemed to convey approval through means Elena's senses couldn't quite process. The young predator has spoken her truth. Now others must speak theirs. The Vraxian commander stepped forward, his massive form radiating the dangerous grace of a born warrior. The Vraxian Empire recognizes humanity as equals in the pursuit of strength through honor. We will support their admission to full membership in the Galactic Council. The Tellurian Collective's harmonic voice followed immediately. The collective has analyzed the probable outcomes of human integration under proposed equal partnership protocols. Risk factors are elevated but manageable. Potential benefits include significant increases in innovation indices and problem-solving capabilities. The collective supports trial admission with regular review. One by one, other voices joined the growing chorus of species weighing in on humanity's future. Some expressed reservations, others offered conditional support, but Elena could hear the tide turning. The galaxy was choosing courage over comfort, possibility over certainty. The Zilithians stood alone in their opposition, their pale flesh now dim with defeat. "You are making a terrible mistake," they said, but the fire had gone out of their voice. "You will regret this decision when their nature reveals itself in violence and chaos." "Perhaps," Elena said gently. "But, at least we'll regret it together, as partners making choices that affect us all. That's what civilization is, not the elimination of risk, but the sharing of it." As the debate continued around them, Elena quietly finished her meal, savoring the flavors that connected her to home while contemplating a future among the stars that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. She had come to Kepler Station as humanity's representative in a cosmic civilization beyond imagination. She would leave as something more, a voice that had spoken for every species that ever chose growth over safety, change over stagnation, the difficult path over the easy one. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Elena didn't know where she had heard that phrase, but, as she sat surrounded by alien minds that were slowly accepting humanity as partners rather than problems, she understood its truth. She had not destroyed her human nature to accommodate galactic civilization. Instead, she had embraced it fully, and, in doing so had found strength that no external force could take away. The stars were calling, and humanity would answer, not as apologetic newcomers seeking acceptance, but as equals bringing their own gifts to the vast community of minds that spanned the galaxy. It would not be an easy path, but Elena had learned something important today: the most meaningful journeys never were. Outside the vast windows of Kepler Station, distant suns continued their eternal dance across the cosmic dark, and, among them, carried by ships built by predators who chose to reach for beauty instead of blood, humanity began to find its place in the endless conversation between the stars.